And Barrie, where do you think we stand as the flag falls on this election?
Well, I have been watching politics for a long time, and you really shouldn't underestimate what we just saw then. It might have looked like a white car going through the gates of Government House and a little more than that, but that was a real moment in history. And it was a moment in history because of the person sitting in the back seat. It wasn't Kevin Rudd, it was Julia Gillard, and that in itself was extraordinary. And when you say what can we expect in coming weeks, the electorate's still coming to terms of what's going on right now, because you only have to go back 8 months, and this was going to be a contest between Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull. And it appeared at the time as if Kevin Rudd had Malcolm Turnbull's measure. In fact, there was even expectations, I think, within the Labor Party that they would win with an increased majority. But then, of course, Malcolm Turnbull was out, Tony Abbott in, and is that Julia Gillard? No, we're just seeing a replay of the shots as Julia Gillard arrived at Government House. So once Tony Abbott then took over the leadership from Malcolm Turnbull, the whole dynamics changed again, because that coincided with the very time that Kevin Rudd's popularity started to decline. And it got to a point there where, in fact, there was an expectation within the coalition that they would win the election. And, of course, remarkably, the Labor Party then responded to that by replacing Kevin Rudd with Julia Gillard. So I think the electorate is still trying to come to terms with the contest, the nature of the contest. And we've only had the new teams in place for 25 days. So that's, I think, what makes this election a very, very tricky one to call.
It does, and Julia Gillard says, Barrie, that she doesn't want to relive the past, but as you've just indicated, we should, because this time last year there was a gathering of Liberals down at one of the local restaurants in Kingston, and they were asked to write on their beer cases how many seats they thought they would lose at the next election, and the lowest number was 20. So it is an extraordinary circumstances. There is a contest at all, and Tony Abbott has made this a contest. And I know that there are some of the Labor side who are still feeling reasonably confident about this, but you wouldn't want to underestimate him, would you?
No, and I think if you did a beer coaster test today, I think it'd be all over the place. And because it's so different in every state. Queensland, of course, is the most interesting because it's a real battleground. There are so many marginal seats at stake there. But also that's where it's toughest to figure out the impact of the leadership change and what will it have. It's one thing to argue that there might be some resentment in Queensland to Julia Gillard taking over from their Kevin, but keep in mind what the polls were showing before Julia Gillard took over from Kevin Rudd. The polls were dreadful in Queensland for Labor. They looked like losing somewhere between 8 and 10 seats, and that was reflected in New South Wales as well. So to what extent has that changed? I suspect that the Labor Party has reasonably comfortable, must be feeling reasonably comfortable about this. They must have some very recent polling. Otherwise, I think they would have waited another week or so. There's a news poll out on Monday. They might have wanted to be just a little more reassured that they're in a sound political position. The fact that they've gone at what I regard as probably the first real opportunity politically for Julia Gillard suggests that they've got something. They've picked up something around the traps that encourages them.
It is interesting with the last public polling that we've seen, though. We've seen a primary vote for the Labor Party of 39%. Now, that would be seen to be dicey by many, and even though it gives you a two-party preferred of 52-48, that's assuming that you're going to get 80% of the Greens' preferences, and you couldn't really assume that, could you now, Barrie, particularly if the Greens are going to pick up a lot more than they usually do in an election campaign?
Well, perhaps you can. See, this is what's changed with the Greens' preferences, that when Kevin Rudd was at his most unpopular, the Green vote went up to about 14%, but that was a particularly soft Green vote, and therefore the Labor couldn't rely on its preferences to the same extent. At the last election, the preference flow was 80%. But once you threw in all those soft Green votes, the preference flow was about 68%. Now that Green vote hasn't collapsed, but it's diminished. They're more your traditional Green voters now that are in that category, and therefore more likely to be more disciplined in the way that they move their preferences. So I think you're probably moving back more towards an 80% situation. And so if Labor's sitting with a primary vote of about 40%, that would probably be enough.
Barrie, how well do you think over the last 3 weeks that Julia Gillard's gone about sandbagging against some of those real issues that she had? Obviously, the mining tax was absolutely toxic, particularly in Western Australia and in Queensland. That seemed to go off reasonably well, but the whole border security thing looked a little untidy.
Yeah, look, I think you have to separate the politics from the policy. I think they made some progress on the politics, but messed it up in a policy sense, and they've still got some work to do, both on the mining tax, but more importantly on asylum seekers. I think they probably got the part of the political outcome they were looking for, that is to neutralise the issue to some extent in some key seats, but as a policy, it's fraught with danger down the track, and that's the real trap now for climate change. She's going to deal with that now in the atmosphere of an election campaign, not divorced from it as she did with mining tax and asylum seekers. And I guess they would take a good political outcome against a policy position, but that won't be good for the Gillard government further down the track, I think that is in fact the case.
Yeah, I think, Barry, sometimes it's hard for people who live and breathe politics, and particularly people who live and breathe politics inside the inner city and inside the state circle in Canberra, to understand just how difficult border security is for the Labor Party in those outer western seats of some places like Lindsay. But clearly we hear words from the government like toxic and visceral as the reaction to what's happened over the border security policy. You're hearing obviously the same things, that the government was bleeding to death over this.
Yeah, look, I think the border security issue is in many senses an easier one for the coalition than it is for Labor, because the traditional Labor Party supporters are split on this. You have your sort of working class people in the western suburbs who have very strong views about border security. They want the government to take a tough approach. And then you have your sort of inner city Melbourne constituency that has a very different view. And that's why I think the government might have shored itself up in some of those seats like Lindsay in New South Wales, for example, but the price might be that they could lose Melbourne, but lose Melbourne to the Greens.
And what about that, Barry? The Greens are saying that not only are they going to take the balance of power, they are saying that they are quite confident that they might take some House of Representatives seats. Now, easy to say, hard to do.
Yeah, though I think they've got a realistic chance of winning one, and that is the seat of Melbourne. Lindsay Tanner kept it for Labor at the last election, but only by 4.5%. There's no doubt that his personal vote held that seat for Labor. Now he's gone. It's much tougher for the new candidate, and the Greens candidate is really quite an attractive candidate and is a very good campaigner. So I would imagine that's a very tough one for Labor to hold, but that's not where they'll be looking anyway. By and large, they'll be looking at the seats that they're fighting with the coalition over in Queensland and New South Wales in particular.